Kind of the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to Israel versus Iran is obviously the implications for Britain. And if you've been watching the news lately, which I'm guessing you have, you will have seen that UK bases in Cyprus were targeted. So I've got an article up here, I'll just read that quickly. So Britain is not at war, the government said on Monday, despite saying it would allow the US to use British bases during its war with Iran, and after a Royal Air Force base in Cyprus was attacked by an Iranian-made drone. Sirens sounded again at RAF Akrotiri on Monday, and British warplanes were scrambled, apparently in response to a new threat. So, Iran directly fired drones, 3 drones I believe, one of which hit, 2 of which were intercepted, but Iran flew 3 drones at one of our bases in Cyprus. Now, this is presumably a preemptive strike in the event that Iran and the regime believe that the UK would get involved. They would join America, they would join Israel, and they would join them in their war against Iran. So they preemptively struck, or tried to strike, an RAF base in Cyprus. Our beautiful allies of Trump and the big Yahoo are giving us a saving grace. So it's already spilling over. So Israel has forced America to go to war against Iran, to launch preemptive strikes, to hopefully try and cripple the country, cripple the regime, to install regime change. However, this has already spilled over to other US and I say Israeli in that because they're not really allies of Israel, more so allies of the United States, but still allies of, we'll call it the coalition. So allies of the US-Israeli coalition have been struck in the Middle East already, with Iran striking multiple civilian and kind of economic pieces of infrastructure in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, places like that. But now Iran have started to target us, kind of America's next strongest ally in the Middle East. So they've kind of preemptively gone for us out of the assumption that we would join in. However, it doesn't look like that the UK government wants to be involved in, which I actually agree with. This is probably the best thing Keir Starmer could have done in this situation. Simply just go, not our war, not our problem. Okay, we're not trying to get involved, which I like. I like that. I don't see the point, to be honest. Yes, the Iranian regime is evil, but what would come afterwards, realistically? Think about that. What would come afterwards? Okay, so they struck Iran, they killed Ayatollah Khamenei. What will come after him? Presumably a more hardline, kind of Islamic, hardline candidate would come forward, someone with kind of more extreme policies, someone with a higher intention to pursue a nuclear bomb, especially after US strikes on the nation. That would encourage and embolden this wing of the regime to go ahead and further pursue a nuclear bomb. It gives them more backing of their argument. So what exactly is this achieving besides wasting taxpayer money on sending missiles to bomb Tehran and other parts of Iran? It doesn't make sense to me. Especially since we'd be putting, pilots' lives in danger, potentially maintenance staff and, soldiers in nearby bases would also be targets. So I agree with Starmer in the fact that we do need to distance ourselves from this war. I know it probably doesn't seem the best that we are distancing ourselves from our allies from this war, but there you go. It's a really difficult situation to be in, I think. We've got a few chats. Worth noting that the British bases in Cyprus are actual British territory, a leftover from our full ownership of Cyprus, not just land leased through the Department of Defence. So the attack on Cyprus is an attack on British soil. This is true. This is true. Now, leads me on to my next point, because the government did say that as a result of these attacks, the UK is not at war with Iran. They're saying that they are not going to escalate after this attack. They are going to take the option to de-escalate, prove that they are not a threat to the regime, and then kind of try and move on, try and form a neutral standpoint and kind of de-escalate, move on, pursue a policy of defense as opposed to offense, which kind of, again, like I said, it's a really difficult situation to be in. On one hand, we never wanted to be in this war in the first place. However, our allies, our close allies in America, technically Israel, but I do not consider Israel a close ally of the United Kingdom. But Iran have kind of looked at us and gone, well, they could get involved. They realistically very much could get involved. So they struck us first. And now it is sovereign UK territory. However, taking a defensive standpoint is probably the best, I think. Rather than going in offensively, now we're just going to start just bombing the shit out of Iran. More so rather put our bases on high alert, put our pilots on high alert, and kind of ensure that any strikes towards UK territory, UK bases would be eliminated and would not hit. I think that'd be kind of the best course of action. But again, you make a good point. Sovereign British territory, just been attacked by a foreign power. It's a really difficult situation. But I kind of want to go more towards, now that we've spoken about the UK, I think this war ultimately proves just how much influence Israel and the Jewish community has in the Western world, specifically the United States. So Trump, for the longest time, has been opposed to a war in Iran. I just pressed keys on my keyboard then, but I don't think it changed anything. No. But during Obama's presidency, Donald Trump made multiple cases that Obama only wanted war with Iran so that he could, get re-elected, basically. And he kind of made multiple cases about why the United States should not go to war with Iran. He's been saying this now for probably a decade, 10 years. He's been saying the same point, that the US should not go to war with Iran because they are not a close enough direct threat. And they've been saying this, Trump's been saying this for a long time. He said it in the 2016 campaign. I don't believe he said it in the 2024 campaign. I know he saw a lot of pressure from the kind of America First kind of faction of the Republican Party. He saw a lot of pressure from those guys to commit to not going to war with Iran, but I'm not quite sure whether he did it in the end commit. However, he's been a very anti-war candidate. He won the ticket that he won, the presidency in 2024, was on peace, not war. Now he's launched a war with Iran at around about the same time that Israel is losing popularity amongst the American populace, at a time where the Iranian regime is looking weaker than usual due to actions taken by Israel, attacking their proxy network and stuff like that. So kind of it's almost the perfect condition for Israel to go to war with Iran. And then all of a sudden the United States is interested in going to war. This also comes at around the time that the Epstein files have been released, which show Donald Trump in a very, very bad light, and it shows his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, a now known Jewish supremacist man who had had multiple connections and relations with the Israeli government while he was alive, at the time when he was, doing the whole island shit, when he was documenting everything. So it's very clear. And to make another point, Epstein was very closely affiliated with the Israeli military complex kind of intelligence agencies. He was very close with the kind of military intelligence complex of Israel. And so all of this is going on. So the Epstein files are being released. It shows President Trump in a very, very bad light. Israel has the perfect conditions to go to war with Iran, and all of a sudden an anti-war candidate wants to go to war with a country halfway across the world that they have been saying that they should not have been going to war with for the past 10 years. If that spells out to you anything other than the Jewish lobby in the United States government is so kind of bloated and powerful, and that Israel has a lot of power and influence over the United States, then I fear you're not looking into this enough. Either that, or you are yourself Jewish, or you're kind of one of these kind of infatuated centre-right pro-Israel shills like Richard Tice or Nigel Farage. And it is so obvious that Israel has used their influence within the United States government with President Trump to continue their kind of conquest of destabilization and their chaos campaign across the Middle East. They've used all of that to kind of propel it forwards. Okay, so you had it to begin with when Hamas did attack Israel first, and Israel went really hard into Gaza, are still going really hard into Gaza, have manufactured, produced, and maintained the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet, an active genocide in Gaza, so that they have orchestrated all of this with incredibly little pushback from their allies, besides ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu, a few kind of big figures in his government and in his cabinet, and some travel bans. Their biggest ally in the United States has done nothing. Donald Trump has done nothing. Joe Biden did nothing to... I don't know, it wasn't Biden that was in power at the time. It was like getting towards the end of his presidency. But Israel have kind of... They went in hard, so hard in Gaza, and they're still going hard in Gaza. They've done it in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. They've been bombing Syria. They've been going to war with Iran and bombing Iran, bombing targets in Qatar, and kind of, all in all, indulging in kind of, I would argue, terror practices in quite a few countries, terrorist moves, while also destabilizing the wider Middle East to fulfill their goals. But what are their goals? What is the end goal of Israel? It's pretty obvious what the end goal of the United States is. Their end goal is very obviously kind of regime change in Iran to get a more suitable government so they can ensure that they will not try and pursue a nuclear bomb. That's at least the main and most public motive of the United States. There's also obviously to serve, Jewish interests in the government, Israeli interests in the government as well. But what is Israel's endgame? What do Israel want from this? Because, Israel have a large army. They have one of the best intelligence agencies in the world. They have a nuclear stockpile of around about 90 warheads. So, what are they afraid of? It's not so much they are afraid of Iran, it's more so that they are being rivaled and challenged by Iran. So kind of for the longest time in the Middle East, ever since decolonization, Iran has kind of been the most kind of obvious regional hegemon of the Middle East. They've always been the strongest, kind of most populous, kind of biggest economy, besides Turkey, of course. So kind of Iran have always been the regional power of the Middle East. But now Israel is growing really rapidly, and they want to become the new regional power of the Middle East. They want to go unchecked in the Middle East. They want to be able to conduct themselves however they wish in the Middle East. I do believe to a certain extent that some members of Netanyahu's cabinet wants to realize Greater Israel, which, if you do not know, let me pull up a quick map of Greater Israel. But I believe that some members of kind of Netanyahu's cabinet, the more kind of hard right, that is not it. Here it is. This kind of the majority of Syria, a large part of Iraq, a large part of Egypt, all of Lebanon, all of Jordan, all of Kuwait, and a large portion of Saudi Arabia. And that was supposedly promised to them by God in the Bible, in the Talmud. Talmud? But supposedly God promised Abraham these lands for the Jewish community to populate. And I do believe that some members of the Israeli cabinet, kind of the more far right members, do want to realize and assume this kind of Greater Israel, at least, if not that by border, unchecked Israeli power, so that they will be free from kind of any threat. Okay, so it's very obvious that they want to become unchallenged and the main regional power of the Middle East. Israel already is the main Middle Eastern power and has been since it existed. Look it up, the 6-Day War. Yeah, obviously with the 6-Day War, yeah. But you got to think, when I say that Iran is the biggest kind of Middle Eastern power, I mean the fact that Iran's population is 92 million people. Now, what's the population of Israel? Population of Israel, 2026. 9 million, 9.5 million people. So Iran have a lot more, like a bigger population, which means that they can, obviously field a higher manpower. They have a reasonably stable economy. Well, they have done prior to this, which links back to me saying that's kind of perfect conditions. They had a relatively-ish stable economy, relatively-ish stable regime, quite a firm regime, kind of Islamic fundamentalist kind of regime in power, and it was relatively stable with no signs of crumbling, unlike other powers that have come and gone, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq and stuff like that. So kind of Israel's main rival in the Middle East is Iran, the only nation that can kind of put Israel in check is Iran. So in order for Israel to conduct themselves in the Middle East however they wish, they would need to eliminate or cripple their rival of Iran. Population doesn't matter. We're not talking about conventional warfare when Israel has nukes. That prevents any Iranian ground invasion. But realistically, Israel's never going to use nuclear weapons, are they? No one would let that fly. That wouldn't happen. Israel would not reasonably use a nuclear weapon on Iran. The international community, the United States, the UK, the EU, NATO, Russia, China would not let that happen. The biggest powers in the world would not let that happen, reasonably. It wouldn't happen. If Israel used a nuclear weapon, reasonably the world's over. Because then that's World War III at that point. China will get involved, which will force the United States to get involved, potentially some NATO countries to get involved, Russia as well, North Korea. Multiple nuclear powers will join this war, and it's game over at that point. So that won't work. The United States have been kind of off and on at war with Iran for probably the better part of, since the 50s, the 60s, 70s, that kind of time. And the US has had nukes. That has never deterred Iran. Because the Iranian regime knows that Israel would never use a nuclear weapon on them. That would never be allowed to happen. Okay? So they know that this nuclear card would it's empty. Okay? It's false, it's fake, realistically. So you'd have to put it in terms of conventional warfare at that point, missiles, kind of naval power, economic power, regional influence. You'd have to put it in that way. And in that way, in terms of standing army, the air force, missiles, regional influence and political stability, Iran has had the upper hand for quite a long time. But now at this point in time, over the past few months, since kind of probably a month before the 12-day war that we saw last year, Iran, well, that kind of faded away. Iran's kind of upper hand, so to speak, their kind of mixed upper hand faded away. Their political instability started to fall. Their economy, as a result of their economy, kind of Israel has been, outproducing Iran in terms of better quality military equipment, and so they struck Iran middle of last year in the 12-day war, and now kind of that it's passed, they've seen another opportunity. They've dragged the US back in, and they've gone in for a much more kind of hard, firm pause. They've gone in for a much more devastating long-term operation. They've already assassinated Ayatollah Khamenei. They have taken out a bunch more kind of top-ranking officials that he was meeting with. So Israel now has the upper hand. Israel now knows to maintain the upper hand, they have to keep this war up. They have to keep this going. They have to keep hitting Iran, and they need to behead the snake and cripple them, which realistically it will happen. Realistically, the combined military force, the United States and Israel, will cripple Iran, will cripple the leadership, will cripple the economy, and they will not, and their military, it will cripple their military as well. So Iran will not be able to recover for a very long time, which would mean that Iranian proxy networks, like the Houthis, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, who Israel have been actively at war with for a very long time now, since 2024? I believe 2024. But their proxy networks would die. Israel would have a much easier time on their borders. Hezbollah would fade away relatively quickly. If Israel decided to go in for a war, that is, to kind of bombard them and just take them out, or whether they would just leave them to it. And Hezbollah would know that they are under-equipped. That's kind of what they would be banking on. Hamas would stop seeing support from Iran. There'd be a lot less of a kind of challenge to Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. America and Israel and wider trade in the Red Sea would be more or less unchallenged, unfazed due to the Houthis. So Israel would have a lot easier time conducting themselves, conducting their goals, their wars, their chaos campaign across the Middle East with Iran crippled. And that's why I do think they've gone in now. They've brought in the United States to go in now to kind of cripple them, to then go ahead and continue to conduct their business as usual.